Welcome to King County Connects, where we connect you with some of the important issues in the county. I'm ENRIQUE CERNA. Shootings are contagious. That from King County prosecutors who are studying gun violence from a public health angle. The program is called Shots Fired, and it's designed to help end gun violence. Joining me now with more is Senior Deputy Prosecutors KARISSA Taylor and Dan CAREW. Welcome, good to have you here.
Thank you. Shots Fired.
When did this project start and how did it come about?
It started in 2016 when we applied for a grant through the Federal Bureau of Justice. It started because the head of our homicide unit asked a question as he was thinking about firearm violence. And his question was, how many people were shot in the past year? And no one in King County had an answer. And they said, okay, how about last month? How about last week? Okay, how many people were shot yesterday?
They really didn't have answers for this.
No, so there's 40 law enforcement agencies in King County. They all have separate ways of keeping reports and keeping data. So individually, they could have each answered that question, but there's no collective understanding of what shots fired, what gun violence looked like in King County. So our office, along with public health and 7 law enforcement partners, wrote a grant to study firearm violence from a public health perspective. And one of the key findings that we relied on was a public health finding in 2013 that one of the things that was stopping a public health approach to firearm violence was the lack of reliable data around what firearm violence looked like. So our grant set out to form our unit, the 2 of us and then a data analyst, to compile all of that information from our law enforcement partners and start to answer the question, how many people are getting shot? And there's a whole lot of other things we collect from pre-existing law enforcement information about firearm violence, but that was really the genesis of the project.
In some respects here, you became epidemiologists because you're looking at this not just as a crime and law enforcement. From the public health factor, really you're looking at it almost as a disease.
That's right, and I think our public health colleagues would cringe to hear you call us epidemiologists.
Oh, I'm sure they would.
But your point's well taken. I think we really wanted to understand not only how many people are getting shot, but where they're getting shot, what kind of the demographic breakdown of people who are getting shot looks like in terms of age and race and gender. And so we really wanted to look and dig into those to see if we could identify any trends or any common themes across those.
But that's not really the type of thing prosecutors do or law enforcement does either.
No, it's a very new role for us specifically and for our office for sure.
And nationally.
And nationally, correct. I'm not sure of any other prosecutor's office that is leading this kind of effort. One of the reasons was because of the number of law enforcement agencies. Someone needed to kind of be the central the collector of all the data, and we were the natural partner for that. But our office is interested in trying to look at firearm violence differently. And is there a way to take a public health approach and do more in the prevention intervention support way as opposed to always just responding and reacting after the fact to shootings?
How about selling that idea of looking at this as a public health issue versus just a criminal issue? Was that a hard sell?
Well, you know, I think a big part of kind of the public health approach generally is just the idea that you want to understand the problem before you start to tackle it. So in that sense, it was pretty easy. It was a pretty easy sell just to say, look, we really want to understand this before we try to come up with any kind of solutions. And then working with law enforcement, I think we were both pleasantly surprised by their response to us wanting to do it this way. Of course, law enforcement has been collecting this information and thinking about ways to prevent crime for a long time. They're kind of the experts in that field, but they were really interested in trying to use this data to be more proactive, to work more on prevention and intervention and not just kind of traditional law enforcement roles. So I think we were both pleasantly surprised by that.
So how many law enforcement agencies in the county did you end up kind of working with? And actually, what was the challenge in doing that? Because I would imagine that's a process of herding cats, and everybody's got a different way of doing stuff.
That is correct. So we work with 8 primary partners right now. The grant was written with 7, but we've added an 8th. Seattle Police Department, King County Sheriff's Office, Renton, Tukwila, Des Moines, Federal Way, Auburn, and Kent. Those were the first agencies we've started out with. This year, the goal for 2019 is to add the rest of King County to that, so we have the full picture of King County. But with those 8 jurisdictions, we felt like we had a pretty good handle on what was going on from a countywide perspective. The hard part, which I had no idea, I'm a very traditional prosecutor, I've never done anything around data, was that each agency had their own report management system, their own way of collecting data, their own way of determining whether or not something was firearm involved. So we spent a lot of time defining terms and arguing about what a shots fired was and was not, and making sure that the data was reliable and consistent amongst all those agencies.
So there were silos you had to kind of
Yes.
go in and break down to
We
try
did.
to... Okay, tell us how you're...
Silos between each other and then silos with us. And luckily, we have a great relationship with our law enforcement partners, and they have relationships with each other. So it just took a lot of time for us to come to the table and talk about what we're doing and why. And I think the analysts at each of the agencies were a big reason that the project worked, because they were very interested from the very beginning in working with other agencies and with us.
The name Shots Fired, who came up with that?
That's a really good question.
I mean, it's perfect,
Yeah.
because it is really what this is all about.
And I think I don't know who we give credit to for that, but I think the genesis of it was really, not only do we want to understand how many people are actually getting shot, but we also want to understand how many times is a gun actually being fired in the county. So many shootings that we see are drive-by shootings where you might only have damage to a vehicle or damage to a house where no one was actually injured. So no one was actually shot, but that's still important information. Oftentimes we find that the difference between someone being shot or not shot can be, a matter of inches, hitting the seat next to you in the car or the pillar behind the window when you're sitting there driving. So we wanted to make sure we were capturing those. We also wanted to make sure we were capturing all those other shootings where there's a report of a shot fired and law enforcement arrives to the scene, and maybe all they find on the ground are some shell casings, or maybe you just have a witness who said, I saw someone actually pull the trigger. Those were all important for us to capture because I think they tell part of the story about what firearm violence really looks like. Exactly. And so we wanted to make sure we were capturing that.
Now, one thing that I know that you learned really is that much of this is happening in South King County.
Yes.
What does that tell us?
We're not sure. We're not epidemiologists or public health experts or even criminal justice experts, I suppose. We're not sure. I think what it tells us is that we worked with the right partners in doing this grant, and that a lot of our focus as prosecutors and as public health needs to be in South King County. And South King County has works really well together. Yeah.
So that's the part of it you still have to break down and try to find what the deal is. Let's talk about the data of this, because I found this kind of very interesting in that some of the breakdown of the data shows, well, for one thing, the number of shooting incidents that happened, like versus 2017 from 2015, and you saw really an increase over in those years. Any reason behind that? Have you been able to figure that out, other than the fact that more people are out there shooting at each other?
Yeah, it's hard to kind of draw any conclusions about why exactly anything's happening. One of the things that we're really proud that we've been able to do is, we started this at the beginning of 2017 when we got the grant. So we started collecting data in early 2017. We continued through 2018. And we were actually, while we're collecting that, we also went backwards to try to go and get data from 2015 and 2016. So we can really get an understanding of what firearm violence looks like kind of historically and be able to make those kind of comparisons. You can make kind of a year-to-year comparison, but those don't always tell you that much. How many you've had through February of any given year isn't really predictive of what's going to happen the rest of the year. So what we found in 2017, now that we've got the 2016 and 2018 numbers, is that it was really kind of an anomalous year, just high volume of firearm violence. And it seems to have kind of, in 2018, regressed kind of back to what we saw in 2015 and 2016. And hopefully we're down about 11% from 2017 and 2018, and hopefully we'll continue to see that decrease. But as for the reasons why, it's really hard to point to any one particular factor.
Now, one of the things you looked at as well is that who's doing the shooting. And the fact is that the majority of the shooting are done by men, or males. And although women are involved to some degree, but it's substantially, or for the most part, it is males. And is there a particular age group here we're looking at?
Yeah, I think most of our, like you said, both in 2017 and 2018, a majority of the people who are actually pulling the trigger are males, and tends to be on the younger end of the spectrum. We haven't done a full breakdown of 2018 in terms of who's actually been charged with shootings, but I know from our experience and what we saw in 2017, it tends to be usually somewhere in the kind of 17 to 30 range where you see most of the violence, and particularly those years kind of 20 to 24, I think, where we see the most.
Is it gang related for the most part, or do you know yet?
We don't know. We have stayed away from using gang as one of our data points. For us, we're really focused on guns and where the guns are going and what the story the gun can tell us. So we've done a lot of work around watching where guns have gone across the county. So we know that firearm violence in King County is very multi-jurisdictional. So a gun just doesn't stay in Seattle or stay in Kent. That gun can be fired all over the place. So we're much more interested in the story of that gun, where it's been and what it's doing. The trail of the gun. The trail of the gun. The gang question isn't as useful for us. It doesn't really tell us much.
Okay. Let's go back to the idea of the trail of the gun, because it also tells you kind of a story in many ways, and that some people that I know the University of Washington looked at this in a study, and also kind of breaking down who might have been involved, and also kind of that whole factor of the trail of a gun. But it seemed like you could tell that maybe someone that they'd seen a shooting, or else they had a family member that had been shot. There was this connectivity that was going on here. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of social research out there about the contagion effect of firearm violence, and the closer you are to firearm violence, the more likely you are to either be a victim or to pick up a gun yourself. It's kind of the handshake idea. We've done some work around that here, but we relied on that as one of the basis of our grant proposals, that firearm violence is a very contained kind of problem in King County, and so we're hoping to use some of that information to actually drive some prevention intervention strategies.
So how are you then reaching out to the community? Because obviously in looking at this, you're prosecutors and you're working also with law enforcement.
Yes.
And I would take it that what you're also doing is you mentioned you're not epidemiologists, and those folks probably would be rolling over, say, when I called you that. Or I'm just saying that was kind of the type of work. But you're looking for public health really to take a stand in this, or be involved in all of this as well.
So we have partners in public health, and also at Harborview, we're hoping to work a little more closely with some of the research that they're doing up there. One of the gaps in data that Harborview and public health have always had is law enforcement data. Law enforcement data is very hard to come by. So that's one of the things that we can provide for them as an understanding of firearm violence in a way that they haven't had before, and hopefully that will inform some of their already existing strategies. Again, public health and Harborview have been doing this work for a long time. We're hoping just to partner with them. And so we've been able to provide them with data and some understanding from the law enforcement perspective of what firearm violence looks like. We have also spent a lot of our time talking to community partners, people that are actually working in these neighborhoods and these communities that are impacted most by firearm violence. Making sure that the data is only part of it. There's also the story and the real impact that it has on people's lives. So we go in and we talk about the data that we're finding, make sure that it comports with what their lived experience is, and then hope that something that we have can be helpful to them as they try and be more efficient about their own work. So we've been talking a lot to community partners about what we're seeing with the violence and trying to work with them to come up with some different prevention intervention strategies.
Who are the community partners that you work with and reach out to?
None of them have given their permission for me to talk about them. I would say
you can tell me. It's no problem.
We're working with a number of community-based organizations that are very neighborhood-focused and are trying to do real work in their communities.
What do they tell you is their challenge out there?
Funding and capacity building, I think. As they go into their communities, the needs of both the victims and the witnesses and suspects of firearm violence can be so multifaceted, from homelessness to education needs to trauma-informed therapy, mental health, substance abuse, that there's a real need for wraparound services, and that takes a lot of capacity and a lot of funding.
Yeah, and a lot of work just to maintain time in the community. Let's talk more about this idea of kind of transitioning. Well, I mean, it's really, you're not going to get away from the fact that you have to have law enforcement involved.
Correct.
There's going to be prosecutors involved. But the public health angle to this, why is that so critical? Because I know that at the national level, doctors have spoken out about this, only to be shot down or at least challenged by the NRA, told them stay in your lane, although they pushed back on that. But they haven't gotten the congressional funding that they needed in order to be able to look at these issues because of the strength of the NRA. But why do you see that the public health angle is so important?
Because I think there's a unique opportunity to work with the community in a different way. You know, law enforcement in the prosecutor's office comes in after the harm has already been done, responds to a scene, prosecutes the case, but the harm to both that individual and the suspect and the defendant has already been caused. Is there a way for law enforcement and the prosecutor's office to get in front of that and to be thinking about this as a community public health problem that can be solved by having everyone at the table working together? And that hasn't really been tried in King County before. I think law enforcement has tried to do a number of things, the community tries to do a number of things, but having everyone at the table talking about how we can work together, I think that might be, we're hoping that this is a new angle for that. So for instance, one of the things that we can do is we know who is getting shot, and is there a way to provide that victim services in a way that hasn't been done before? If we're worried about them as a public health response, either picking up a gun or getting shot again, don't we have an opportunity to intervene and hopefully provide community supports to those victims and the victim's family so that they don't find themselves a victim of firearm violence or they don't pick up again? So how do we get something in place where that victim feels that community support and they don't feel alone and isolated?
Who is getting shot? I mean, we do know that, you know, mainly males, but who else is a target here, or how's that breaking down?
So yeah, last year in 2018, 86% of our shooting victims here in King County were male. 37% were under the age of 25, and 76% were people of color. So that's pretty consistent with what we saw in 2017 as well. In 2018, that's taken from 55 firearm homicide victims and 191 non-fatal shooting victims. So a little over 240 people in the county shot last year. And I should say, when we're collecting this data, the one thing that we don't have included in these numbers are deaths or injury from suicide or suicide attempts, as well as officer-involved shootings. Those are all, that data is collected elsewhere. Again, we were trying to kind of fill this gap of the law enforcement data. So those numbers don't include those two
And
categories.
when we talk about the trail of the gun, where's the intersection there with what you found in your data as far as them, you know, may have not been involved just with one pistol or one rifle or whatever, but is there this consistency in that they've all either seen a shooting, may have been shot, that type of thing?
Sure. I think one of the things that has kind of been borne out in the research around firearm violence and on the national level, and then I think we're also starting to see it here, is that firearm violence is very, very concentrated, both in terms of geography, both in terms of the place where firearm violence tends to happen, and then also in terms of the people who tend to be involved. So with regard to the places where firearm violence tends to happen, it's not, it's very concentrated, and not just like a city that has a lot of it, or not a neighborhood. We're talking very specific, almost street segments where you see a lot of firearm violence. And it's not that those places in and of themselves are inherently dangerous places. That's where the people who are involved in shootings tend to congregate. And so it's a very, very small group of people who are actually willing to pick up a gun and use that gun to shoot people. And so we're trying to kind of get a better understanding of who's involved and who that very small group of people are, so that we can again focus our kind of prevention and intervention efforts there, but also in terms of law enforcement, so that they're able to kind of get a better understanding of that as well.
And why? The why factor about why they're willing to pull the trigger or pull out a gun or get a gun and use that instead of trying to talk to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really, really hard question to get to the bottom of, mostly because there's often a lack of opportunity to sit down and ask people why they did this for various reasons. But it's a hard question to answer, one that we would love to know, though.
Either they've been shot or they don't want to talk, they don't want to snitch, these types of things. So that seems like it's a huge barrier to try to break.
It is for us. It's really not it's that those questions are difficult. We don't have the opportunity to talk to, especially suspects and suspects a lot. I think there is a lot of work in the county by other groups trying to get to the root of that question, doing panels on youth violence and doing some focus groups with youth violence to figure out the reasons why. Again, those are questions and answers that are going to come from the community and public health and not from law enforcement.
So you guys are unique, aren't you, in the sense that not many prosecuting offices are working in this way and looking at the whole approach and trying to deal with this from a public health perspective.
Yeah, it's unique, and it's a great county to be in order to do this. We have both the backing of the council and the backing of our boss, Dan Satterberg. I'm not sure that would happen in a lot of other places. King County has always been progressive and thinking about things outside the box, and Dan Satterberg has always wanted to do something, always wants to try new things and try and get a handle on crime. So it's a pretty great place for us to be.
Are you hearing from others who want to know what you're doing and how you're doing it?
All the time. We're always getting requests from other jurisdictions, prosecutors' offices, detectives and other agencies want to know what we're doing and how.
Are others trying to take this approach?
I think they're trying to take pieces of it. Every jurisdiction is going to be unique. Our big hurdle was the 40 law enforcement agencies. No other county has that many. Other jurisdictions don't have as good relationships between law enforcement and public health, or law enforcement and the prosecutor's office. So there are other jurisdictions that are trying to take pieces of it and do it themselves.
Funding. Tell me about the funding on this. I think you got a grant to begin with. And
we did.
Yeah.
We got a federal grant. It was a 2-year grant. It funded Dan and myself, and then we have a data analyst who does the work primarily with the law enforcement analysts. So that grant ended December 31st, 2018. We were then, in the fall, we appealed to the King County Council, and a line item was added to the budget to fund primarily myself and our data analyst, and then our office is funding Dan in the prosecutor spot. So the original 3 remains.
Yeah. What do you want to try to accomplish, I guess, in this coming year? And maybe, I don't know how much farther your funding goes. Does it go beyond this year?
The next 2 years of the grant cycle.
Right. So what do you want to try to get done in that amount of time?
We're trying to narrow our focus and do fewer things well. So one of the things we want to do is expand and collect data on shots fired from every jurisdiction in King County so that we have the entire picture and not just from the 8 jurisdictions. That's on the data front. We also really want to look at unsolved shootings. So cases where someone has been shot and the case hasn't been solved or referred in for charges, and start to dig in. There's a national conversation going on about that issue. Dig into why those aren't being solved, see if there's things that can be done differently from our side, from victim outreach, from law enforcement, but get a handle on what that looks like. We also want to have some better processes, which is such a boring thing to talk about, but some processes in place to get victims the help that they need, the community support they need within 1 or 2 days. So the community is doing some outreach with that family to provide them supports. And we would also like to, the other witnesses and other people that are around firearm violence, we'd like to get some processes in place that those people are also able to avail themselves of community resources, whether it be mentoring or some post-traumatic stress kind of counseling, but that we're really looking at not just focusing on solving the case and charging someone, but who else is impacted by firearm violence and what can the community and public health, Harborview, do to help surround that person with community supports.
In this process, too, are you looking at where the guns are coming from at all?
We try. It's really hard to get good data on stolen firearms. That's one of the things that we'd like to be looking at in the next couple of years.
Yeah, just the challenge of that. It seems like it would be a heck of a challenge, to try to find out where the guns are coming from.
And anecdotally, I think in our experience, you often see that the guns are stolen, and they tend to be stolen from houses that don't have some kind of safe storage in place during a burglary. Even cars, we see a lot of guns stolen from cars. They don't have a gun safe or anything like that. So it's another way that we're trying to work with public health. They have a big campaign that they've been working on, their Lock It Up campaign, to really try to push and promote safe storage. And it's really one of those places where our 2 goals really overlap. So if we can prevent guns from being stolen, they're going to not be used in shootings as much. So it's just another example of that work with public health.
Who came up with the idea of saying, okay, we need to look at this from a public health perspective?
I think it was the head of our homicide unit who very progressively and kind of thinking outside the box said, let's do something different.
And Did the two of you, did you have any doubts about that? You know, I mean, you guys are the ones that take them to court and try to get them sent up.
I didn't. I'd been doing gun crime and gang crime for about 8 years in the prosecutor's office, and I was ready to do something different and really interested in if there was a way to prevent firearm violence and think about it in this new approach. I was all in from the beginning.
Yeah. You think it can make the difference?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something you
Yeah.
want to add?
I was just going to say, for me, it was natural. I'm a kind of data nerd to begin with. So the idea that we could actually start collecting data and think about being more evidence-based and data-driven in the way that we were dealing with things, that appealed to me right away.
Okay. Well, you know, I think you need to come back here over the next year so we can find out what process or progress that you've made
Absolutely.
in finding out other things. I'd really like to hear, because this is unique and this is very different, and it's happening right here in King County. So I really appreciate you taking the time to fill us in on all of it. All right, KARISSA
Thank you.
Taylor and Dan CAREW. No, he's not related to Rod CAREW, if anybody remembers who Rod CAREW is, a baseball player. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us today for this edition of King County Connects. I'm ENRIQUE CERNA. Visit us online at KINGCOUNTY.GOV/KCTV. And we'll see you next time.